The city is burning, not at its edges, not in a distant quarter, at its center. The warehouses along the Thames are collapsing in on themselves, and the smoke that pours upward is not the smoke of an enemy's torch. It is the smoke of indecision made visible, of an empire that spent 2 centuries choosing comfort over consequence. The year is 1940, but the fire you are watching was lit long before a single German bomb fell on London. Stand in the cabinet war rooms on the 10th of May. The wallpaper is damp, the maps are wrong. The man being sworn into office as Prime Minister has just inherited not a nation but a wound. An open, self-inflicted wound that has been bleeding since Versailles, since the Somme, since the moment Britain looked at what the last war cost and decided the next one must never be allowed to happen, regardless of what that decision would eventually cost instead. You need to understand something before this story begins. The British Empire at its peak in 1922 controlled more than 24% of the world's land surface. Its navy had ruled the seas for over a century. Its diplomatic corps had engineered the balance of power across 3 continents. It had defeated Napoleon. It had survived the mutinies of 1857. It had sent its sons into the mud of Flanders and dragged them back, barely catastrophically, but it had dragged them back. No external power could break it. That is not a boast. That is the forensic premise of this entire investigation. Because what the historical record shows, what the memoranda, the cabinet minutes, the treasury correspondence, and the private diaries of the men who ran this empire all confirm, is that the decline of British power in the 20th century was not imposed from outside. It was authored from within, by specific men, in specific rooms, making specific choices that they knew or should have known would have catastrophic consequences. The enemies of Britain, the Kaiser's Germany, the Axis powers, the Soviet Union, the independence movements of the colonies, all of them attacked, all of them pushed, but none of them delivered the fatal wound. Britain did that itself. This video will prove that the collapse of the British Empire was not a military defeat, not an economic accident, and not the inevitable consequence of decolonization. It was the product of a specific institutional psychology, a recurring pattern of deferral, denial, and deliberate self-deception that appeared not once but across 5 consecutive crises, each of which the empire survived, and each of which left it weaker than it would have been had Britain simply acted when the evidence was clear and the cost was manageable. This is the autopsy. The body is enormous. The cause of death is small and entirely preventable. Goldo, the country that broke itself at Versailles. Paris, June 1919. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles is arranged for the signing of a peace treaty, and the light through those enormous windows is almost offensively beautiful for what is being done in that room. The German delegation sits in deliberate humiliation, not at a table with the victors, not as negotiating partners, but as defendants. The treaty they are about to sign has been presented to them as a fait accompli. There were no negotiations. There was no German input into the terms. There was a document, and there was a deadline. The British delegation knows this is wrong. Not morally wrong, though several of them believe that too, but strategically, structurally, architecturally wrong. John Maynard Keynes, serving as the principal representative of the British Treasury, has been arguing against the reparations terms since January. He has written memoranda, he has attended meetings, he has used the word catastrophe in official correspondence. He will resign before the treaty is signed and return to Cambridge to write what becomes one of the most prophetic economic documents of the century, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he argues that the reparations burden imposed on Germany is not merely unjust but self-destructive, that it will destabilize the European economy, impoverish Germany beyond recovery, and create the precise conditions in which extremist political movements flourish. He is right about all of it. He is right within the decade. But Keynes is 36 years old and his objections are inconvenient. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, is caught between his own private doubts and the electoral reality that the British public, having lost 700,000 soldiers and another 1.6 million wounded, wants punishment, not calibrated, strategically intelligent punishment, raw, visible, declarative punishment. Lloyd George privately told colleagues that the German reparations figure, eventually set at 132 billion gold marks, was likely uncollectible. He said this out loud, in private, in rooms where it was recorded. He then went to Versailles and signed the treaty anyway. This is the first self-inflicted wound. Not the existence of Versailles. Punitive peace treaties had been written before and would be written again, but the specific dynamic it reveals, that the British leadership class in 1919 possessed accurate information, credible expert opinion, and private recognition that the course they were pursuing would produce a disaster, and they pursued it anyway because the political cost of honesty exceeded their willingness to pay it. Lloyd George was not a stupid man. His coalition government had just won the 1918 coupon election on a platform of making Germany pay, of squeezing the German lemon until the pips squeaked. That last phrase coined by his colleague Sir Eric Geddes and delivered to a cheering crowd in Cambridge. Lloyd George knew what the pips were. He knew what squeezing them would produce, but the crowd was cheering, and the crowd had votes. The consequences arrived on schedule. Germany's hyperinflation crisis peaked in 1923 when the exchange rate hit 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. A wheelbarrow full of currency could not buy a loaf of bread. The middle class, the professional, educated, property-owning backbone of any stable democratic society, was wiped out financially in a single year. The psychological damage to German national identity was not incidental to what followed. It was structural. Adolf Hitler's first significant political speech in Munich in 1919, the year of Versailles, was attended by fewer than 100 people. By 1923, the National Socialist German Workers' Party had over 50,000 members. The connection is not simplistic, but it is real, documented, and drawn explicitly by Hitler himself in Mein Kampf, which cites the Versailles shame as a founding grievance. Britain did not create the Nazi Party, but it helped architect the conditions in which a movement like the Nazi Party could not only survive but thrive. And having done so, it then spent the next decade pretending the connection did not exist. The deeper forensic question is not whether Lloyd George made a mistake. He did, and he knew it. The question is why the institutional structure of British decision-making produced that outcome despite the information being available and the analysis being correct. The answer sits in something the historian Harold Nicolson, who was present at Versailles as a junior diplomat, identified in his 1933 memoir. He called it the conference psychology, the tendency of large diplomatic gatherings to generate momentum toward whatever outcome required the least immediate political courage, rather than whatever outcome the long-term evidence supported. The treaty was not the product of clear strategic thinking. It was the product of group pressure, electoral fear, and the exhaustion of men who had been at war for 4 years and wanted it to be over. This pattern, intelligence available, decision distorted by political pressure, long-term consequence deferred, future crisis enlarged, is not a single event. It is the recurring grammar of British imperial decline. The Treasury's own estimate in 1921, prepared by a team led by Sir Basil Blackett, concluded that Germany could realistically pay no more than 30 to 50 billion gold marks without economic collapse, less than a quarter of the figure eventually demanded. This estimate was read, it was filed, it was not acted upon. There is a particular kind of institutional cowardice that is worse than ignorance. Ignorance can be forgiven, it cannot be helped, but the deliberate filing away of inconvenient accuracy, the conscious choice to know something and then behave as though you do not, is something else entirely. It is what Keynes called, in a private letter to his mother in June 1919, a mortal swindle. He was talking about Germany. He may not have understood that he was also diagnosing Britain. The decade Britain chose to forget it had an army. By 1932, the British Army had effectively disarmed itself. not in response to a treaty obligation, not under duress, by choice systematically across a decade of budget cuts so severe that the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir George Milne, told the Committee of Imperial Defense in 1926 that the army was, in his words, unable to put a single division in the field ready for war. This statement was classified. It remained classified for decades. The policy responsible for this condition had a name: the 10-year rule. It originated in a cabinet memorandum from August 1919, the same year as Versailles, the same year as Keynes's resignation, and it held that for the purposes of military planning and budget allocation, Britain should assume that there would be no major war for the next 10 years. Initially, this was a reasonable planning assumption for a country that had just ended a catastrophic war and needed to rebuild its finances. The Treasury demanded it. The cabinet approved it. What made it extraordinary, what elevated it from a planning assumption to a pathology, was the decision made in 1928 to make the 10-year rule self-renewing. Instead of revisiting the assumption annually and deciding afresh whether the 10-year window still applied, the cabinet under Stanley Baldwin decided that the rule would simply roll forward automatically. Every morning, Britain woke up with 10 years of guaranteed peace ahead of it. Evidence to the contrary, German rearmament, Japanese aggression in Manchuria, the rise of fascism in Italy, would need to overcome an institutional presumption of safety that reset itself daily. Winston Churchill, who had himself been Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1924 to 1929 and had presided over significant defense cuts in that role, later called the 10-year rule an excuse to strip the armed forces. He was not wrong, but he also did not distinguish himself during those years. His own budget speeches praised the savings achieved through military reduction. He was as captured by the logic as anyone else. The logic was not irrational on its face. Britain in the 1920s faced a genuine fiscal crisis. The national debt had risen from £650 million in 1914 to £7.8 billion in 1919, a 12-fold increase in 5 years. Interest payments alone consumed 44% of government expenditure by 1920. The pressure to cut spending was real, the need for economic recovery was genuine, and defense is always the most visible target for cuts because its costs are immediate and its benefits hypothetical. No politician was ever voted out for a war that did not happen. But the 10-year rule was not simply a budget instrument, it was a cognitive instrument. It gave officials at every level of the defense establishment formal permission to stop war planning, to stop running the exercises, writing the contingency documents, maintaining the supply chains, training the specialist units, and performing the uncomfortable institutional work of remaining ready for something you have decided will not happen. The rule did not just cut the army's budget, it cut the army's imagination. By the time the rule was formally cancelled in 1932, cancelled not by a sudden burst of strategic courage, but because Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 made its absurdity undeniable, the damage was extensive and specific. The Royal Tank Corps had no modern tanks. The Royal Air Force had no effective bomber that could reach Germany. The British Expeditionary Force, the professional army that would theoretically be deployed to the continent in the event of a European war, existed on paper as 6 divisions and could realistically field 2 divisions in an era when the German Wehrmacht was already planning the force structure that would eventually field over 150. The Committee of Imperial Defense, the body responsible for coordinating defense planning across all 3 services, produced a report in November 1933, just 9 months after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, that assessed the German rearmament program and concluded, "Germany is the ultimate potential enemy against whom our long-range defense policy must be directed." This conclusion was accurate, timely, and immediately filed without action. The cabinet noted it, the treasury ignored it, the army continued to shrink. There is a parliamentary exchange from March 1934 that belongs in any honest account of this period. The Secretary of State for Air, Lord Londonderry, was asked by the opposition whether the government had a plan to respond to German air rearmament. His answer, delivered with the serene confidence of a man who had confused optimism with analysis, was that Britain's policy was to support disarmament generally and that German rearmament should be met with further international agreement rather than competitive expansion. The question had been practical. The answer was liturgical. This matters for a reason that goes beyond the obvious military consequences. The 10-year rule and the attitudes it produced were not the creation of a single political party. They were bipartisan. The Labour government of Ramsay MacDonald from 1929 to 1931 was, if anything, more committed to disarmament than the Conservatives who preceded them. The Liberal Party, under various leaders, had been advocating military reduction since before the First World War. The British public, surveyed repeatedly through the early 1930s, expressed overwhelming support for disarmament and the League of Nations. The peace ballot of 1934 and 1935, completed by over 11 million people, the largest voluntary survey in British history to that point, found that 90.6% supported membership in the League of Nations and 74% supported military reductions. No politician who read those numbers could easily advocate rearmament without risking his seat, and most of them did not try. The system was working exactly as democratic systems are designed to work, aggregating public preferences and translating them into policy. The problem was that the public preference was based on a misunderstanding of the strategic environment, and no senior figure in the British government made a sustained public honest effort to correct that misunderstanding until it was nearly too late. Stanley Baldwin, Prime Minister twice during this decade, told the Commons in November 1936, after he had already begun tentative rearmament efforts, that in 1933 and 1934 he had known rearmament was necessary but had delayed public advocacy for it because he feared losing a by-election in East Fulham, where a pro-disarmament candidate had just won a stunning upset. "Supposing I had gone to the country and said that Germany was rearming and we must rearm," he said, "does anybody think that this Pacific democracy would have rallied to that cry at that moment? I cannot think of anything that would have made the loss of the election from my point of view more certain." He said this out loud in the House of Commons as a defense of his own behavior. The House received it with murmurs, but not with the outrage it deserved. Baldwin was admitting that he had subordinated national security to electoral calculation, and the institution whose job was to hold him accountable heard him and moved on. The damage done during this decade was not simply military, it was psychological. A generation of British military officers had been trained and promoted inside a system that rewarded the management of decline rather than preparation for conflict. The staff officers who would lead the British Army into France in 1940 had spent their formative professional years inside an institution that had officially decided war was not coming. Their planning assumptions, their logistical expectations, their estimates of what the enemy would do, all of it was shaped by a decade of institutional self-deception. Dunkirk was not a miracle, it was a bill. The man who mistook a dictator for a problem he could solve. There is a document in the British National Archives, File Prem 1-66A, that contains the handwritten notes Neville Chamberlain made during his first private meeting with Adolf Hitler at Berchtesgaden on the 15th of September 1938. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Chamberlain had flown to Germany for the first time in his life at the age of 69, had never flown before, to discuss Hitler's demand for the annexation of the Sudetenland, the German-speaking western region of Czechoslovakia. The notes are remarkable not for what Hitler said, but for what Chamberlain concluded. He wrote to his sister Hilda that evening that he had found Hitler to be a man who could be relied upon when he had given his word. He described Hitler's eyes as showing a man of determination who would not readily be turned from his purpose, but also a man whose word once given would not be broken. He was describing a man who had broken the Treaty of Versailles by remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, a man who had annexed Austria in March of that same year in direct violation of the treaty framework, a man who had stated in writing in a published book, available in English translation since 1933, that the territorial ambitions of the German nation extended far beyond the Sudetenland. Chamberlain had read Mein Kampf. His biographers confirm this. He had access to every intelligence report the Secret Intelligence Service and the Foreign Office had produced on Hitler's intentions since 1933. He had the testimony of every British diplomat, journalist, and visitor who had spent time in Germany and returned to brief the government. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, had visited Hitler at Berchtesgaden himself in November 1937 and had returned with a clear sense that Hitler's ambitions were not limited to the Sudetenland or even to the German-speaking populations of Central Europe. Halifax wrote in his own notes that Hitler regarded war as a legitimate instrument of policy and that his territorial appetite would grow with feeding. And yet Chamberlain came back from Munich on the 30th of September 1938, waving a piece of paper. The paper, signed by himself and Hitler, committed both governments to resolving all future disputes through consultation. The crowd at Heston Aerodrome cheered. Chamberlain stood on the steps of 10 Downing Street and said the words that have echoed through the decades with the particular resonance of a statement that was wrong in a way that matters. I believe it is peace for our time. He believed it. That is the most damning thing about Neville Chamberlain. Not that he was cynical or corrupt or cowardly in the ordinary sense, but that he genuinely believed what he was saying. He had constructed, through selective reading of evidence and motivated reasoning that his own private correspondence reveals in uncomfortable detail, a version of Adolf Hitler that matched his need for a diplomatic solution. The real Hitler, the one documented in intelligence files, in the testimony of foreign observers, in his own words, did not match the solution Chamberlain needed. So Chamberlain created a different Hitler. The forensic record is specific about how this happened. Chamberlain received in August 1938 a memorandum from Sir Robert Vansittart, the chief diplomatic advisor to the Foreign Office, that assessed Hitler's intentions with direct and documented clarity. Vansittart wrote that Hitler's goal was not a revision of Versailles, not a correction of the specific humiliations of 1919, but German hegemony over Europe, and that no diplomatic concession of any magnitude would satisfy it. This memorandum was not the opinion of a wild-eyed alarmist. Vansittart had spent years cultivating intelligence sources inside Germany, including within the Nazi Party itself. His analysis was shared in its essential conclusions by the Foreign Office's German experts, by the military attaché in Berlin, and by MI6's station in the German capital. Chamberlain responded to this memorandum by removing Vansittart from any operational role. In January 1938, 8 months before Munich, Vansittart had been kicked upstairs to the specially created title of Chief Diplomatic Advisor, a position that carried prestige and no authority. He could produce memoranda. He could attend certain meetings. He could not alter policy, speak to the press, or brief opposition politicians. The most informed analyst of German intentions in the British government had been quarantined from the decision-making process by the Prime Minister he served. This is not a peripheral detail. It is the mechanism. When the evidence contradicts the conclusion you need to reach, you do not revise the conclusion. You reassign the people producing the evidence. Chamberlain was not alone in this. The cabinet he led was divided, but the critics, Duff Cooper at the Admiralty, Anthony Eden, who had already resigned as Foreign Secretary in February 1938, over a separate but related disagreement about appeasing Mussolini, were isolated, outvoted, and in some cases briefed against by Downing Street. The permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, Sir Alexander Cadogan, kept a diary that has since been published and that shows entry by entry a man who disagreed with Chamberlain's assessment and said so privately, and then went back to his office and implemented it anyway. The post-Munich period is, if anything, more forensically interesting than Munich itself, because Chamberlain, in the immediate aftermath of the agreement, received confirmation that his assessment was wrong, not from opposition politicians, not from foreign observers, but from his own government's intelligence apparatus. The Secret Intelligence Service reported in October and November 1938 that Hitler had been contemptuous of the Munich Agreement in private, that he had told senior Wehrmacht officers he was furious at having been cheated of a war he wanted, and that German planning for the occupation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia, not merely the Sudetenland, was already underway. Chamberlain received these reports. He instructed that they should be more carefully evaluated before conclusions were drawn. Czech independence ended in March 1939. The reports had been accurate. The price of Chamberlain's motivated reasoning was not simply strategic, it was temporal. Every month of the appeasement period was a month of German rearmament, German operational planning, and German diplomatic positioning. When war finally came in September 1939, Germany had an air force roughly 3 times the size it had been at Munich. The Wehrmacht had completed its planning for operations against France and had tested its coordination mechanisms during the Spanish Civil War in ways that would not have been available to it had the confrontation come earlier. Britain had gained time, it is true, and used some of that time for rearmament, particularly in fighter aircraft production. But it had also ceded strategic initiative in a way that cost lives measured in hundreds of thousands. The most honest thing Chamberlain ever said about his own policy came in a private letter to his sister, written on the 20th of March 1939, 4 days after German troops entered Prague. "I am afraid," he wrote, "that I was wrong. He destroyed no documents. He took no dramatic action. He continued in office for another 14 months, presiding over the declaration of war he had dedicated his political life to preventing, and was removed in May 1940 not by electoral defeat, but by the loss of confidence of his own parliamentary party, which, having supported him through 3 years of a foreign policy its own members had privately doubted, finally found that even its tolerance had limits." He died on the 9th of November 1940, 6 months after leaving office. The Blitz was underway. His biography, written with unusual candor by Keith Failing in 1946, captures him in his final months reading the newspapers, watching the sky, and saying very little. The empire that forgot its colonies had heard the speeches. There is a particular irony embedded in the history of British decolonization that the conventional narrative tends to soften, because acknowledging it fully requires acknowledging a contradiction at the core of British imperial identity. The British Empire spent the better part of 2 centuries educating the people it governed, teaching them English, training them in British legal traditions, sending their most talented members to Oxford and Cambridge, having them read Locke and Mill and Burke, teaching them that the freedom of the individual from arbitrary power was not merely a political preference, but a moral universal. And then, when those people concluded that this universal principle applied to them, Britain was surprised. It should not have been, it could not honestly have been. Jawaharlal Nehru, the man who would become India's first Prime Minister, studied at Harrow and then at Trinity College, Cambridge, graduating in 1910 with a degree in natural sciences. He read the English liberal tradition. He knew what it said. He drew the obvious conclusion. In his autobiography, written during one of his many imprisonments by the British government, he spent a total of over 9 years in British prisons. He described his political awakening as coming not from external ideology, but from the direct application of English liberal philosophy to Indian conditions. "I read," he wrote, "and was convinced. The argument was made in your own language by your own thinkers. I used it." Kwame Nkrumah, who would lead Ghana to independence in 1957, studied at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania and the London School of Economics. He read Clausewitz, Marx, and Marcus Garvey, but the political grammar of his argument, the right of peoples to self-determination, the illegitimacy of governance without consent, was the grammar of Locke filtered through Jefferson, which had itself been filtered through a British intellectual tradition that Britain had exported globally as proof of its own civilizational superiority. Ho Chi Minh petitioned Woodrow Wilson at Versailles in 1919, the same conference, the same year, the same room, for the application of his 14 points to French Indochina. He was denied an audience. He named the rights he was claiming: freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right of subject peoples to legal equality with their rulers. These were not Marxist demands, they were Whig demands. They were precisely what the British liberal tradition had argued for at home since the 17th century. Britain had exported a civilizational argument that eventually invalidated the conditions of its own empire. But recognizing this required a kind of institutional self-awareness that the imperial establishment was structurally incapable of producing, because the people most responsible for governing the empire were also the people with the most to lose from acknowledging what its own logic implied. The 1942 Cripps mission to India, led by Sir Stafford Cripps, a member of Churchill's war cabinet, sent to negotiate Indian cooperation in the war effort in exchange for a promise of post-war dominion status, failed for reasons that reveal this dynamic with particular clarity. Cripps arrived in Delhi in March 1942 with an offer that the Indian National Congress had been demanding for 20 years. He arrived 2 months after the fall of Singapore and the capture of 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops. The largest surrender in British military history, had destroyed whatever remained of the myth of British military invincibility in Asia. He arrived as Japanese forces were advancing through Burma toward the Indian border. The offer he carried was genuine: post-war dominion status, the right to leave the Commonwealth, an elected constituent assembly to frame a constitution. What it was not was immediate. India was asked to continue fighting Britain's war now, on the promise of freedom later. Gandhi called it a post-dated check on a failing bank. The characterization was sharper than it was fair. Cripps was acting in good faith, but it captured something real. Britain was asking India to trust an institution that had repeatedly broken its word about Indian political progress, at a moment when the military rationale for Indian loyalty to that institution had just been demolished on the beaches of Malaya. The mission failed. The Congress launched the Quit India movement in August 1942. Britain arrested Gandhi, Nehru, and most of the Congress leadership within hours of the movement's launch. A response so swift and so prepared that it revealed what the British government actually believed about the sincerity of its own offer. You do not preposition arrest warrants for the people you have just offered independence to, unless you have decided at a level below conscious policy that independence is not actually what you intend to deliver. The economic relationship between Britain and its empire during and after the war contains a number of specific figures that belong in any honest account of why British imperial authority collapsed so rapidly after 1945. India, which had entered the war as a debtor to Britain, emerged from it as a creditor. By 1945, Britain owed India approximately £1.3 billion. The sterling balances accumulated through Indian purchases of war materials and services that Britain could not pay for in cash. This debt was not a gift. It was the arithmetic consequence of a colonial economy being mobilized for a war it had not been consulted about. The men who managed the demobilization of the British Empire in the late 1940s were administering the dissolution of a financial structure that had already effectively ended. The speed with which the empire dissolved after 1947, India and Pakistan independent in August, Burma in January 1948, Ceylon in February 1948, Israel declared in May of the same year, the Gold Coast on its path to Ghanaian independence by 1957, is sometimes described as graceful retreat, as enlightened recognition of historical inevitability. It was partly those things, but it was also the product of a fiscal reality that left Britain with no alternative. The 1947 fuel crisis, when coal shortages shut down industry, halted trains, and left homes unheated in one of the coldest winters of the century, had exposed the gap between British imperial pretension and British economic capacity with a directness that no amount of diplomatic language could obscure. Attlee's government did not give India independence out of liberal idealism, though idealism was present. It gave India independence because the alternative, maintaining the military and administrative infrastructure of direct rule against the resistance of a population that had heard every argument Britain ever made for freedom and was now making those arguments back, would have bankrupted a country that was already functionally bankrupt. The wound here is not the decolonization itself. The wound is the 60-year delay, the 6 decades between the first serious articulation of Indian political claims in the 1880s and the actual transfer of power in 1947, during which Britain could have managed a transition that preserved relationships, maintained alliances, and built the kind of post-imperial network that a forward-looking power might have used to sustain its global influence. Instead, the delay produced bitterness, produced the conditions for partition and the million deaths that came with it, and produced in country after country a relationship with Britain defined by the memory of resistance rather than the foundation of partnership. An empire that exported the argument for its own end, and then spent 60 years insisting that argument did not apply. The economy that chose prestige over survival. Valse. On the 15th of September 1931, the crew of HMS Valiant, HMS Rodney, HMS Nelson, and several other warships of the Atlantic Fleet anchored at Invergordon, Scotland, refused to put to sea. The British Navy, the institution that more than any other single thing had underwritten the security and commercial reach of the British Empire for 3 centuries, mutinied, not violently, not dramatically, but functionally. The men simply declined to carry out orders. They were protesting pay cuts of up to 25% imposed without warning by the national government's emergency budget, cuts that hit ordinary sailors far harder than officers because they were calculated on pre-war pay rates that junior ranks had never received. The men were not wrong about the math. They were not wrong about the injustice. They were not wrong that the cuts had been handled incompetently and without consultation. What the Invergordon mutiny did, beyond its immediate shock to the British political establishment, was trigger a run on the pound. International investors and currency traders, watching the flagship of British military power refuse to function, drew their own conclusions about institutional stability. Within days, gold reserves were hemorrhaging at a rate the Bank of England could not sustain. On the 21st of September 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard, the monetary framework it had maintained, with one wartime interruption, since 1717. The pound fell 25% against the dollar within weeks. Britain had returned to the gold standard in 1925. This is the specific decision that requires forensic attention because it was the wrong decision, it was known to be the wrong decision, and it was made anyway for reasons that had more to do with national prestige than national interest. Churchill, as Chancellor, had restored the pound to its pre-war parity with gold in April 1925, 4 torrent 86 to the pound, the same rate that had prevailed before 1914. Keynes had opposed this decision with the same vigor and the same accuracy he had brought to Versailles. He published The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill that same year, the title a deliberate echo of his Versailles pamphlet, arguing that returning to gold at the pre-war parity overvalued the pound by approximately 10%, that this would make British exports uncompetitive, force deflationary pressure onto wages and prices, produce industrial contraction, and result in mass unemployment. He was right. By 1926, the overvalued pound had contributed to the conditions that produced the general strike, the largest industrial stoppage in British history, 9 days in May, during which the TUC called out workers across transport, printing, docks, iron and steel, and building industries in support of the miners whose wages had been cut to maintain coal export competitiveness in a market where British coal was now 10% more expensive than it had been before the gold standard decision. Churchill had made the gold standard decision not because he was ignorant of the economic arguments against it. He received Keynes's analysis. He received similar analysis from figures inside the Treasury. He himself reportedly said, "I would rather be wrong with the Treasury than right with Keynes." But because the symbolic value of restoring the pound to its 1914 parity was enormous, it was a declaration that Britain was back, that the war had not diminished it, that the empire's financial architecture was as sound as it had ever been. It was a lie told in the language of monetary policy, and like all such lies, it required increasing effort to maintain until the moment it became impossible to maintain at all. The decision to return to gold at the wrong parity, like the decision to impose reparations at Versailles, like the 10-year rule, like the appeasement of Hitler, shares a common structural feature. It was a choice made to manage the perception of British power rather than to manage the reality of it. The gap between Britain's performed strength and its actual strength was a recurring theme of the interwar period, and it is not coincidental that the men responsible for most of these decisions were the same generation, men born in the 1860s and 1870s, educated at institutions that had taught them that British power was a natural condition of the world, who had come to maturity during the high Victorian period when that power was real, and who spent the rest of their careers refusing to accept that it had fundamentally changed. The economic consequences of the gold standard decision extended far beyond the 1926 general strike. The persistent overvaluation of sterling throughout the late 1920s contributed to Britain's particularly severe experience of the 1929 global depression. When Wall Street crashed in October 1929, the deflationary pressure that the gold standard imposed on all gold standard countries was especially brutal for Britain because it was already operating with a structurally overvalued currency. Unemployment rose from 1.2 million in 1929 to 2.5 million in 1930 to 3.4 million by early 1932, roughly 22% of the insured workforce. The industrial north and the Welsh valleys, already struggling from a decade of export disadvantage, entered a depression from which some communities would not emerge for decades. The political consequences were equally significant. The financial crisis of 1931 destroyed the Labour government of Ramsay MacDonald, tore it apart over whether to implement spending cuts that most of the cabinet believed were unjust and economically counterproductive, but that international creditors and the Treasury insisted were necessary to defend the pound. MacDonald's decision to form a national government with conservative support against the explicit instruction of the Labour Party he led was seen by the Labour movement as betrayal so complete that it shaped Labour Party thinking about economic management and the relationship with the City of London for the next 30 years. The entire episode, Gold Standard Restoration, General Strike, Depression, Crisis of 1931, Abandon of Gold Standard, Sterling Devaluation, is a case study in the cost of choosing performance over analysis. Britain in 1925 did not need the gold standard. It needed competitive industry, sound public investment, and a currency set at a rate that reflected actual economic conditions rather than imperial memory. It chose the rate that felt like 1914 because 1914 felt like strength. But 1914 was already gone. It had been gone since 1918, and the institutions responsible for making that acknowledgement found that they could not bring themselves to do it. The Suez delusion. The moment Britain learned it was not itself. On the 26th of July, 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser stood before a crowd of hundreds of thousands in Alexandria and announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. He was broadcasting live on Egyptian radio. The speech was long, rhetorical, and deliberately structured to allow a specific word, the name of Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French engineer who had built the canal, to serve as a coded signal to Egyptian army officers stationed at canal zone installations to begin the physical seizure of company property. Before the broadcast ended, Egyptian engineers were taking control of the canal's operations. The maneuver was prepared, disciplined, and executed with a precision that the subsequent British response would notably fail to match. Anthony Eden, who had replaced Churchill as Prime Minister in April 1955 and had waited 11 years for the job, received the news over dinner. His reaction, according to multiple accounts including that of his private secretary, was visceral and immediate. He compared Nasser to Mussolini, invoked the lessons of appeasement, reached for the Munich analogy that had become the universal reference point for British foreign policy thinking since 1938, and told the assembled guests that Nasser could not be allowed to have his hand on our windpipe. The Suez Canal carried approximately 1/3 of Britain's oil imports. Eden understood the economics. What he failed to understand, or rather what he chose not to understand, was that the world of 1956 was not the world in which the Munich analogy had been formed. He was about to prove it. The British and French response to nationalization moved through three phases: diplomatic pressure, which failed, covert planning, which was exposed, and military intervention, which succeeded militarily and was catastrophic in every other dimension. The operational plan eventually executed, Operation Musketeer, involving an Israeli attack on Egypt, followed by a coordinated Anglo-French ultimatum to both sides to cease fire and withdraw, followed by Anglo-French military intervention ostensibly to separate the combatants but actually to seize the canal, was not merely duplicitous, it was transparent. The United States government, whose support was essential for any British military action in the Middle East, was not told. The Commonwealth, whose endorsement would have provided crucial political legitimacy, was not consulted. Canada's Prime Minister, Lester Pearson, who would win the Nobel Peace Prize the following year for his role in negotiating the Suez Crisis resolution, was told by Eden's government at each stage of the escalation that there was nothing to worry about, that Britain knew what it was doing, that the situation was under control. It was not under control. It was the opposite of under control. Eisenhower, whose administration had been informed of the collusion between Britain, France, and Israel through intelligence channels despite not being officially briefed, was furious, not primarily on moral grounds, though the deception offended him personally, but on strategic grounds. The Suez operation was being conducted at the exact moment when the Soviet Union was crushing the Hungarian uprising and Eisenhower was attempting to occupy the moral high ground of Western liberalism against Soviet imperialism. Britain had just handed the Soviet Union a perfect argument that Western democracy was no different from Soviet force, that empire, not principle, was what governed the behavior of Western powers. Khrushchev used it immediately and at length in every international forum available to him. The American response was specific and devastating. The United States did not simply express displeasure. It went to the International Monetary Fund and blocked the emergency loan that Britain needed to defend the pound sterling, which had come under immediate speculative pressure when the military operation began. Harold Macmillan, who as Chancellor of the Exchequer had been one of the strongest advocates of the military operation in the initial cabinet discussions, told Eden on the 6th of November, the day after the landings had begun, that Britain had lost $40 million in gold and dollar reserves in a single day, that the pound was under severe pressure, and that without American financial support, which was being explicitly withheld, the position was untenable. Britain halted its military operation on the 7th of November 1956, 36 hours after landing. French and Israeli forces, who had no equivalent financial vulnerability, were stunned. The British had started a war they could not afford to finish. The pound stabilized only after the United States indicated it would support the IMF loan, conditional on a ceasefire, conditional on British withdrawal, conditional on compliance with UN resolutions that Britain and France had vetoed. The conditions were humiliating, they were accepted. Eden resigned in January 1957, citing ill health that was real enough but that no one, including Eden himself, according to the account of his doctor, believed was the only reason. What Suez revealed was not that Britain had made a bad tactical decision. It revealed that the fundamental assumption underlying British foreign policy since 1945, that Britain remained a great power capable of independent military action in its own imperial interests, was false, and had been false for years before anyone in authority was willing to say so. The United States had been subsidizing British solvency since Lend-Lease in 1941. The post-war American loans of 1945 and 1946 had kept the British economy functional during the transition from wartime mobilization. The sterling area, which gave the pound a global role that exceeded Britain's actual economic weight, depended on American acquiescence. Britain had been living on American financial permission since before the war ended, and had continued to behave as though that permission were not required. The Internal Foreign Office analysis produced in the aftermath of Suez, the future policy study of 1960, declassified decades later, concluded with a directness unusual for official documents that Britain needed to accept a reduced role in world affairs, that independent military operations outside the NATO framework were no longer viable, and that British influence should be exercised through American partnership rather than in competition with it. This was the correct analysis. It arrived officially 14 years after the conditions it described had first become apparent. Macmillan, who replaced Eden and managed the transition to this new reality with considerably more skill than his predecessor had managed anything, described the British-American relationship privately as Greeks in the Roman Empire, the cultivated, historically sophisticated subordinate providing wisdom and guidance to the greater military and financial power. It was an elegant formulation. It was also a confession. The Greeks were subordinate. The Romans made the decisions. The verdict: you have now watched a great empire perform its own autopsy. Not once, not at a single moment of crisis, but across 40 years and 5 distinct failures, each of which followed the same grammar, used the same vocabulary, and produced the same outcome: a gap between what Britain knew and what Britain chose to believe, exploited by events until the gap became a wound, and the wound became the record. The forensic conclusion of this examination is specific. The single root cause of British imperial decline was not military defeat, not economic weakness, not the moral illegitimacy of colonialism, not the rise of American power. All of those things were real and all of them mattered, but they were the conditions in which the root cause operated, not the root cause itself. The root cause was a recurring institutional failure to act on accurate information when acting would have required the people in authority to tell an uncomfortable truth to the public, to their party, to their allies, or to themselves. At Versailles, the truth was that the reparations regime would destabilize Europe and create the conditions for a second war. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the truth was that disarmament had left Britain militarily defenseless in a period of growing fascist aggression. In the Appeasement years, the truth was that Hitler's ambitions exceeded any accommodation Britain could offer. In the Imperial period, the truth was that the liberal arguments Britain had made for its own civilization invalidated the conditions of its own empire. In the economic sphere, the truth was that Britain was no longer the financial power. Its institutions behaved as though it remained. Each time the information was available, each time specific individuals within the system produced the accurate analysis. Keynes at Versailles, Vansittart on Hitler, Milne on military readiness, Nehru quoting Locke on Indian freedom, and each time the institution responded not by updating its behavior but by managing the messenger, filing the report, reassigning the analyst, outvoting the dissenter, or simply not acting until the consequences of inaction became more politically costly than the consequences of honesty. This is not a story about villains. Lloyd George was not a villain. Chamberlain was not a villain. Eden, despite Suez, was not a villain in any simple sense. They were talented men operating inside an institutional culture that had been built during a period of genuine British supremacy, that had been rewarded by history for a century of decisions made from a position of overwhelming strength, and that had never been forced to develop the muscles required for honest strategic accounting. When the supremacy eroded, which it began to do in the 1890s when American and German industrial output began to exceed Britain's, the institutions continued to function as though it had not, because they had no other mode. The tragedy is not that Britain declined. All empires decline. The tragedy is that British decline was so much more costly than it needed to be, to the British, to the people governed by the empire, and to the world that watched 2 European wars kill 60 million people that a decade's honest strategic accounting in the 1920s might have prevented. Keynes understood this. In his private correspondence, in the years after the Second World War had confirmed every prediction he had made about the First one, he described the central pathology of British institutional life as the politics of the second best option, the systematic preference for the choice that avoided the hardest immediate confrontation, regardless of what that choice made inevitable down the road. He was writing about economics. He might have been writing about everything. The case file closes here. Cause of death, self-inflicted. Contributing factors: political fear, institutional inertia, and the slow poison of a ruling class that had confused the performance of strength with its possession. The empire that could not be broken from outside broke itself from within, not with a single blow, but with 40 years of managed avoidance, each deferral a small crack, until one morning the structure of the greatest empire in human history looked in the mirror and found that what stared back was not a great power. It was the memory of one.